Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Shiva Asia Putri. I am 5th semester of English Education Study Program of Muhammadiyah University. And in this video, I will explain about the how to describe learning and teaching and this material I have explained in the classroom at presentation. Happy watching! Most adults can learn a language without studying it, providing they are in the right kind of contact with it. Though they might have more trouble with pronunciation and grammar than younger learners, they might still be able to communicate fluently. However, not all adults who come into contact with a foreign language learn it. They might not want to. Perhaps the language they come into contact with is, in their view, just too complex for them. Perhaps they don't hear or see enough of it or have sufficient opportunities to try it out. Children and adults who do acquire language successfully outside the classroom seem to share certain similarities in their learning experiences. First of all, they are usually exposed to language which they are more or less understand, even if they can't produce the same language spontaneously themselves. Secondly, they are motivated to learn the language in order to be able to communicate. And finally, they have opportunities to use the language they are learning, thus giving themselves chances to flex their linguistic muscles and check their own progress and abilities. Babies and children get endless exposure to their first language coupled with emotional support. Adults living in a foreign country get continual exposure to their language at various different levels and can get help from the surrounding language speakers. All these features of natural language acquisition can be difficult to replicate in the classroom, but there are elements which we should try to imitate. Most people can remember lessons at school which were uninvolving and where they switches off from what was being taught them. Frequently, this was because they were bored, because they were not emotionally engaged with what was going on. Such lessons can be contrasted with lessons where they were amused, moved, stimulated, or challenged. It seemed quite clear that those lessons involved not only more fun, but also better learning. Activities and materials which frequently engage students include games depending on age and type, music, discussion when handled challengingly, stimulating pictures, dramatic stories, amusing anecdotes, etc. But even where such activities and materials are not used, teachers will want to ensure that their students engage with the topic, exercise, or language they are going to be dealing with. They will ask students what they think of a topic before asking them to read about it. For example, they will look at the pictures of a person and be asked to guess what their occupation is before they listening to what person on tap. They will have been stimulated by the fact that the teacher, who normally dress very formally and always stays in the same place in class, suddenly arrives in class dress casually and moves around the room with an costume is and so on. Explain grammar. They can study language evidence to discover grammar for themselves. They can work in groups studying a reading text or vocabulary. But whatever the style, study means any stage at which the construction of language is the main focus. Typical activate exercises include role plays, where students act out as realistically as possible, and an exchange between a travel agent and a client, for example. Advertisement design where students write and then record a radio commercial, for example. Debates and discussion, describe and draw, where one student tries to get another to draw a picture without that other student being able to see the original. Story and poem writing, writing in group, etc. If students don't have a chance to activate their knowledge in the safety of a classroom, they might find transferring language acquisition and study into language use in the real world far more problematical. For as long as people have been learning and teaching languages, there has been continual debate about how to describe the process and what the best ways of doing it are. Maturing teaching practice is the direct result of such constructive argument. There have been some traditional language learning techniques that have been used for many years. In more recent times, there have been 5 teaching models which have had a strong influence on classroom practice and which teachers and trainers still refer to. There are grammar translation, audiolingualism, PP, task-based learning, and communicative language teaching. And the first is grammar translation. This was probably the most commonly used way of learning language for hundreds of years, and it is still practiced in many situations. Practitioners think that by analyzing the grammar and by finding equivalence between the student's language and the language to be studied, the student will learn how the foreign language is constructed. It is certainly true that most language learners translate in their heads at various stages anyway. And we can learn a lot about a foreign language by comparing parts of it with parts of our own. But a concentration on grammar translation stops the student from getting the kind of natural language input that will help the acquire language. And it often fails to give them opportunities to activate their language knowledge. The danger with grammar translation, in the other words, is that it teach people about the language and doesn't really help them to learn the language itself. Audiolingualism and behaviorism went out of fashion because commentators from all sides argued that language learning was far more subtle than just the formation of habits. For example, students are soon able to say things they have never heard or practiced it before because all humans have the power to be creative in language based on the underlying knowledge they have acquired, including rules of construction and a knowledge of when a certain kind of form of language is appropriate. Methodologists were also concerned that in audiolingualism, students were not exposed to real or realistic language. PPP, this stands for Presentation, Practice, and Production, and it's similar to the straight arrows kind of lesson described above in PP classes or sequences. The teacher presents the context and situation for the language, example describing a robot, and both explains and demonstrates the meaning and form of the new language can and can't. The student then practice making sentences with can and can before going on to the production stage, in which they talk more freely about themselves. For example, I can play the viola but I can't play the drum. Or other people in the real world, example, my girlfriend can speak Spanish, etc. Task-based learning, here the emphasis is on the task rather than the language. For example, students might be encouraged to ask for information about train and bus timetables, and to get the correct answer, that is the task. We give them the timetables and they then try and complete the task after perhaps hearing someone else do it or asking for example of the kind of language they might want to use. When they have completed the task, we can then, if necessary and only if necessary, give them a bit of language study or to clear up some of the problems they encountered while completing the task. Alternatively, we might ask them to write part of a guidebook for their area. When they have completed the task, which will involve finding facts, planning content, and writing the brochure, etc. We can then read their efforts and do something language or writing study to help them to the better next time. And those are my explanation about how to describe learning and teaching, and I hope you enjoy the explanation and see you again. Bye bye.